Kara Holt worked the rooftop bar of a downtown New Orleans hotel, a place suspended above the city like an island of light and glass. From the 24th floor, the city appeared restless and alive, its pulse rising from the streets below. The air carried the dense smell of river water and overripe foliage drifting in from the Mississippi, mixed with the metallic tang left behind after afternoon rain. Music from the French Quarter reached the rooftop in softened waves, as if traveling through layers of humid air that absorbed most of its sharpness. To visitors, the scene looked enchanted, a curated blend of heat, skyline, and distant sound. For Kara, it formed the static backdrop of her working life, as familiar as the low vibration of the refrigerator units running behind the bar. She had once imagined a future far different from this nightly routine. In those years, she spent her days analyzing case files, writing papers about repeat offenders, and constructing psychological profiles based on fragments of interrogation transcripts. She envisioned sterile rooms with two-way mirrors, interviews conducted under harsh lighting, and hours spent unraveling motives and behavioral patterns. That imagined path dissolved faster than she expected. Her father's illness escalated into the kind that carved through savings, and her mother's sudden death left debts and responsibilities that pushed everything else aside. The university turned into an unfinished ledger of incomplete courses, each one a reminder of the dream she no longer had time to chase. The rooftop bar became the only reliable way to keep the bills paid. With time, she adapted to her environment with the same analytical instinct she once applied to her academic work. She learned to decode posture, tone, and rhythm of movement. The bar served as a living observation chamber. Guests revealed themselves through small, unguarded moments. The hurried gait of someone carrying triumph, the slumped shoulders of those crushed by disappointment, the rigid arms of patrons trying to contain anger that alcohol might loosen. Kara recognized these signs more quickly than most people formed their first impression. It became her silent advantage, a private continuation of a career she never finished. That night the bar reached its peak capacity. Warm wind rolled in through the open glass walls, carrying a dampness that settled on the skin like a thin second layer. The air conditioning barely managed to counter it, pushing out streams of coolness that were swallowed almost instantly by the heat. Inside, the space pulsed with overlapping conversations, clinking glassware, and the constant motion of servers weaving through narrow pathways between tables. A group of Texas investors occupied the center table, their voices rising in bursts. Nearby, tourists pressed their cameras against the windows, attempting to trap the skyline inside digital frames. Along the bar, regulars sat in their unspoken seats, each fitting into a predictable pattern Kara could have charted blindfolded. The atmosphere shifted when a man entered quietly from the elevator. He moved with a deliberate calmness that contrasted with the restless energy around him. His dark suit, worn without a tie, suggested wealth but not ostentation. He chose a spot along the side wall where the city lights reflected across his features, creating shifting shadows that obscured parts of his face. When he ordered a rare bottle of wine, Kara recognized the name instantly. It was one of the high-end items reserved for specific clientele, kept mostly untouched for weeks. Yet his posture lacked the self-satisfied flair of patrons who usually requested it. His focus drifted across the room rather than toward her, as though he had come not to be seen, but to observe. As the evening advanced, she began noticing subtle, repeating patterns in the behavior of those around him. Staff members seemed to adjust unconsciously when he passed. The bartender nearest him quieted his usual chatter. Even the security guard by the elevator shifted into a more attentive stance. Nothing about their actions appeared staged. Instead, it resembled the instinctive alignment of people responding to an unspoken hierarchy. The sensation lingered in Kara's mind, the impression of a gravitational pull centered on a person she had never seen before. The pattern fractured when several new guests arrived separately, each choosing a location too specific to ignore. One sat near the service corridor leading to the stairwell, giving him a view of movement in and out of the restricted area. Another positioned himself with a clear perspective of the elevator and entrance. The third settled at a table with a direct vantage point of both the bar and the man in the shadows. Their appearances suggested generic business travelers, but their posture, controlled breathing, and sharp eye movements contradicted that image. Kara noticed the pale indentation on one man's wrist where a watch had recently been removed, a detail associated with law enforcement training sessions she once studied. Her mind shifted into an analytical mode she no longer used consciously. The bar transformed into a mental map marked with access points, blind zones, and pathways ideal for cornering someone without drawing attention. The terrace and its external staircase formed the most vulnerable convergence of those paths. When she saw one of the suspicious men check his phone and subtly glance toward that very direction, a quiet certainty formed in her chest. The guests were not acting independently. They were positioning themselves around a target. She performed her next actions with practiced calm. She retrieved a fresh glass, poured the rare wine, and placed it onto a tray. The drink served as an excuse to move toward the corner where the man sat, allowing her to pass the others closely enough to confirm her observations. She approached him maintaining the composed expression expected of staff, but her thoughts ran in rapid sequence. As she set the glass before him, she summarized the situation in clinical, coded terms, noting placement, sightlines, and behavior patterns the way she once did in classroom exercises. The man lifted his gaze and regarded her with a steadiness that made her feel momentarily transparent. Something in his expression shifted, and what happened next unfolded with an efficiency that unsettled her. Two guests she had assumed were ordinary patrons moved to block the terrace entrance under the guise of adjusting their seats. The elevator guard locked access to the floor with a discreet button press. A staff member stepped into the corridor leading to the stairwell, subtly obstructing passage. The would-be observers recognized the shift almost immediately. Within minutes, they abandoned their positions, leaving the bar in staggered intervals as though nothing unusual had occurred. To the untrained eye, the night continued uninterrupted. Music played, drinks clinked, laughter rose and fell. But Kara felt the shift deeply. The events had aligned too precisely with her understanding of coordinated operations, the kind rarely visible to civilians. Her observations had been absorbed seamlessly into a mechanism that existed long before she stepped into it, a mechanism built to respond quickly and invisibly. By the end of the shift, her muscles ached with the familiar fatigue of long hours, but beneath that she sensed a trembling unease. The bar emptied. Staff wiped the counters clean and stacked chairs. The city below dimmed into deeper shades of amber and shadow. When her manager approached and quietly informed her that someone had asked her to stay after work, the unease crystallized into something sharper. For the first time in months, she felt a cold thread of fear slip down her spine, a recognition that she had crossed an unseen line without understanding where it led. The man by the window had a name, and when Kara finally heard it, the fragments of tension she had sensed around him began to align. He was called Victor Marceau. In New Orleans, his name belonged to the category of words people preferred to keep low in conversation. It appeared in articles about philanthropy and historical preservation, attached to photographs of restored mansions and charity events. But it also lived in whispered stories about untraceable disappearances, accidents that did not look accidental, and a reputation for cutting traitors out of his life with clinical precision. The journey from the rooftop bar to his car blurred into a series of sensory impressions. The elevator ride down felt too short. The air in the lobby seemed thinner. Outside, the hotel entrance lights flattened the night into a bright rectangle. The black car waited there with its doors already unlocked. Tinted windows turned the interior into a reflective void. When she slid onto the back seat, the thick scent of leather, faint cologne, and metal wrapped around her. The city noise dulled as soon as the doors closed. leaving only the muted hum of the engine and the soft rush of tires over asphalt. She tried to rehearse rites and procedures she remembered from her abandoned criminology textbooks, but none of them fit the situation. There was no police badge, no formal arrest, no official warning. There was only the knowledge that people had tried to trap someone in her workplace and that she had intervened. Each passing block pulled her farther from the version of herself who could simply clock out and take the bus home. Outside, streetlights and neon signs slid past in fragmented streaks. The route turned away from familiar roads and deeper into neighborhoods she rarely visited at night. The car eventually slowed in the Garden District, where houses did not simply sit on their lots but seemed to pose. Iron fences framed careful gardens. Old oaks leaned over the sidewalks, their branches weaving a canopy above the quiet streets. The mansion where the car stopped appeared at first like another preserved relic of a wealthier era. Its wrought iron balconies traced intricate patterns against the facade, and high windows glowed with subdued, warm light. Yet as she stepped out and looked closer, the building produced a different kind of presence, denser and more deliberate, as though it watched arrivals rather than merely receiving them. Inside, the house felt both preserved and modernized in peculiar ways. The ceilings rose high above her, carved and painted long before she was born. Heavy curtains framed tall windows, muted reds and dark greens swallowing portions of the ambient light. Vintage paintings lined the walls, portraits and landscapes sealed behind darkened glass. Beneath that historic surface, she sensed another layer. Some doors bore modern keypads discreetly recessed into the wood. Security cameras hid in corner moldings or behind decorative grills. Hallways extended farther than the outer shape of the house seemed to allow at first glance. Staff moved through these corridors with the kind of quiet efficiency she associated with institutions that prized discretion over friendliness. Some of them looked like conventional private security, their posture shaped by training and habit. Others wore tailored suits and carried tablets or folders, their energy closer to that of in-house lawyers or analysts. A few figures seemed to exist at the edges of activity, appearing in dimmer pockets of space and vanishing again without crossing well-lit thresholds. They acknowledged her presence with brief glances that evaluated rather than greeted. She was told, in measured, practical terms, that sending her back to her ordinary life after what had happened at the bar would be reckless. The men who had attempted the ambush could have seen her, could have associated her with the disruption. If they were persistent, they might search for her. If they were connected to something larger, they might use her as leverage. Under that reasoning, the safest approach, from Victor's vantage point, consisted of containing the potential risk. The explanation wore the shape of protection, but the underlying mechanics resembled containment. The first days inside the mansion folded into a slow, viscous stretch of time. Her phone, resting in her bag, ceased to feel like a tool of independence and turned into a supervised channel. Messages had already been sent in her name, claiming she had accepted a private catering opportunity and would be unavailable. Calls to her father and a handful of people she trusted were permitted, but monitored in subtle ways. Casual invitations from coworkers were redirected with polite refusals she did not write herself. The city that had once unfolded beneath her from the rooftop now appeared only as a framed piece of scenery behind glass. To keep herself from dissolving into passivity, she returned to the method that had always grounded her: observation. The house provided a new field of study. Guards patrolled in rotating patterns that never repeated exactly. Administrative staff entered and left specific rooms according to a schedule that did not match conventional office hours. Deliveries arrived at odd times and through side entrances she would not have noticed on a first walk-through. Certain doors remained perpetually closed, with the kind of stillness that indicated not emptiness but controlled access. Victor spent much of his time in a study that fused the house's old skeleton with contemporary nerve centers. A massive wooden desk anchored the room, its surface marked by age and use. Behind it, sets of monitors displayed feeds that shifted between city street views, interior cameras, maps, and numerical reports she could not immediately decipher. While she still navigated the edges of this environment, he began involving her in small tasks. At first, he asked for impressions after meetings, presenting it almost as a curiosity. Later, he brought her recordings of prior encounters and requested that she annotate them with the same clarity she once applied to theoretical cases. As she worked through those recordings, dormant parts of her training reawakened. She zoomed in on micro-expressions, watching how certain guests stiffened briefly when asked about partnerships or finances. She tracked eye movements when specific names or locations were mentioned. She noted mismatches between verbal assurances and physical responses. Her written assessments matched those of the house's existing analysts more often than she expected. In some instances, her intuitive reservations flagged inconsistencies that had slipped past more conventional vetting, prompting follow-up checks that confirmed hidden tensions or partial truths. The house still functioned as a cage. She did not choose when to leave, and every attempt to negotiate freer movement met with firm, logical refusals pointing back to her safety. Yet within those limits, something else emerged. She ceased to be just the bystander whose presence needed to be managed and became a component in a system built around anticipation and control. Her background, once a discarded path, found a narrow but concrete use. At night, the mansion shifted in ways more subtle than the change of lighting. Shadows along the corridors thickened, stretching across the floors like slow-moving water. The air grew heavier, not simply warmer, but carrying a sensation of age, as if the building exhaled memories when the sun fell. Glass panes that reflected her face clearly in daylight returned distorted versions of her at certain hours, impressions of someone almost like her but slightly out of phase. Occasionally, as she passed unlit junctions, she sensed motion at the periphery of her vision, delicate shapes that dissolved when she turned her head. Other residents of the house adhered to nocturnal routines she did not fully understand. People she rarely saw during the day emerged from upper floors or deeper corridors and held low-voiced meetings in rooms with the curtains drawn. Their gazes lingered on her at times, not in open hostility, but with a calculating curiosity that resembled the way predators evaluated unknown animals on their territory. The feeling pressed on her nerves, a combination of being studied and weighed. She attributed these perceptions to fatigue and the psychological pressure of confinement. It felt safer to classify everything as stress-induced distortion than to admit that her carefully ordered sense of reality faltered. That assumption held until she encountered one particular piece of footage among the security archives Victor asked her to review. The recording captured the exterior of a property associated with one of his competitors. On the screen, figures moved through the darkness around the building. Their transitions between points in the frame occurred with a speed that did not match the usual frame rate blur. Limbs and silhouettes seemed to skip intermediate positions. When she examined the infrared layer, several sets of eyes shone with an intensity and consistency unlike standard thermal reflections, forming pinpoints of concentrated light that appeared almost solid. Kara tried to explain the anomalies through technical flaws. Camera calibration errors, compression artifacts, faulty sensors, tricks of contrast in low light. She replayed the segment repeatedly, isolating individual frames, slowing the footage, comparing it to other clips from different nights using the same setup. The more she inspected it, the less comfortable she felt with purely mechanical explanations. Similar distortions appeared in other recordings flagged for her, and subtle, familiar details in those scenes aligned too closely with the uncanny sensations she had experienced in the mansion's hallways. The disconnect between what she had been taught to consider possible and what the data suggested widened steadily. The conceptual foundations she had relied on during her studies began to feel brittle. Human behavior, as she knew it, still followed recognizable patterns, but something beyond that framework threaded through the operations of the house and its unseen rivals. She sensed layers of rules and histories that predated official records and common knowledge, moving under the surface of contracts, real estate, and security arrangements. It was during this period of quiet internal destabilization that Victor altered the nature of their exchanges. Until then, he had stayed within the boundaries of business language, framing everything in terms of risk, strategy, and confidentiality. As her exposure to the more anomalous material increased, maintaining that facade grew impractical. One evening, in the stillness that settled over the study after most staff had withdrawn, he chose to bridge the gap between what she had inferred and what she could not yet name. He abandoned the pretense that all threats could be reduced to ordinary criminal groups or corporate rivals. He began to speak in measured, unembellished terms about forces and structures that usually survived only in rumor and cautionary tales, not because he sought to impress her, but because withholding that knowledge had become more dangerous than sharing it with someone already entangled in his world. Chapter 3. The idea that New Orleans was divided not only by money, politics, and territory, but also by cycles of the moon sounded at first like a metaphor spoken too calmly. Kara tried to treat Victor's words as symbolic language, perhaps a dramatic way of describing competing criminal groups. But the more she compared what he said to what she had already observed, the more the metaphor thinned, revealing something literal beneath it, something that fit too neatly with the anomalies she had tried for days to explain away. Victor spoke of old families whose histories stretched back to the earliest settlers, arriving with ships that carried not only goods and ambitions, but pacts forged long before America existed. He described agreements older than property deeds, shaped in eras when law was a distant rumor and survival depended on alliances built in the shadows. Some families adapted by mastering commerce and influence. Others adapted differently, drawing strength from the night, from instincts that never evolved out of them. Kara recalled childhood stories, ghost tour mentioning restless spirits, campfire tales of creatures with glowing eyes near the swamps, urban legends of bodies found on the shore with no apparent cause of death. She had always understood these as entertainment meant to thrill tourists or frighten children. But those memories resurfaced now as she watched Victor at dawn, standing by the tall window. The moment the first faint streaks of sunlight touched the horizon, his posture subtly changed. Muscles beneath his shirt seemed to tighten without motion, and his pace slowed, as though his entire body recognized the shift in the sky before he consciously reacted. He never offered theatrics or melodramatic confessions. Instead, he explained with the clinical clarity of someone accustomed to managing a dangerous truth. Some members of his circle possessed senses beyond normal thresholds. Some could detect blood much as a trained sommelier detected tannins. Others read lies by listening to the rhythm of a heartbeat the same way an analyst reads financial tremors. A few avoided daylight not because they were busy, but because their strength dwindled under the sun. None of this was spoken with pride. More like logistics he was tired of hiding. Opposite his faction stood another force, an old one, diffuse and territorial. They lived closer to the edges of the city, in the industrial fringes, abandoned suburbs, warehouses near the port. Their presence seeped into cautionary stories told by truck drivers, hunters, and policemen who patrolled after midnight. They were faster, stronger, more agile when the moon rose, not shape-shifting caricatures from horror films but human bodies pushed past natural limits. Their packs could move through darkness with frightening precision, and their hierarchy echoed predators more than businessmen. Locals called them different names depending on neighborhood, history, or fear, but Victor referred to them as packs. His house controlled the night center, wealthy districts, restored mansions, high-end bars, the tourist quarter. The packs managed the outer rings, forests, cargo yards, forgotten underpasses, rail zones. Between them lived the ordinary population, students, office workers, vacationers, unaware of how thin the boundary was between their world and the other. Kara felt the last resistance inside her begin to fracture. She had tried to rationalize everything, misinterpreted shadows, hallucinations from exhaustion, camera artifacts. But there were too many connections, too many specific details she had no reason to doubt, too many pieces she had personally witnessed that logic alone could no longer hold. Denying it now would be a deliberate lie to herself. Her role began to shift with her understanding. Since she had seen both sides without belonging to either, Victor used her in new ways. She reviewed recordings of negotiations with pack emissaries who sought to establish neutral zones. She watched their posture change depending on the topic, how their breathing quickened when discussing blood debts, how shoulders tightened when territory was mentioned, how their gaze darted when the word prey entered conversation indirectly. She noticed details Victor's analysts overlooked, not because they were careless, but because they lacked her intuition about human, almost human, patterns. The more she contributed, the more woven into the hidden structure she became. Her insights influenced decisions about patrol routes, alliances, and which sectors needed reinforcement. She found herself sitting closer to the table where real decisions were made, though always at the edge, always one step from being either essential or expendable. With this new position came new dangers. The pack led by Elijah Brooks had been pushing for months to reclaim influence, seeking to disrupt Victor's dominance not only over businesses, but over the unwritten rules that govern the night. Officially, their disputes resembled conflicts between private security firms and warehouse contracts. Unofficially, they were battles over hunting allowances, feeding rights, and nocturnal sovereignty. Those in Victor's house protected her because she had become an asset. Those in Elijah's pack saw her as leverage they could exploit. Once she understood the stakes, the world she knew felt like a thin film stretched over something deeper and hungrier. Every streetlight, every alleyway, every quiet neighborhood block concealed the slightest tremor of a system that had existed long before her birth. Even the wind that brushed through the garden at night carried an edge she had not noticed before, a tension in the branches, an alertness in the silence. Kara stood at the threshold of two realities, her feet on a boundary she could not unsee anymore. Her choices shrank in number but grew in consequence. She could learn the rules of this hidden world and adapt enough to survive within it. Or she could retreat into denial and become a target wandering blind among predators who did not forgive ignorance. The night, once just a backdrop to her shifts at the bar, now breathed around her with intent. And somewhere beyond the mansion walls, beneath the dim glow of industrial lights and the shifting clouds over the river, the packs moved, watching, waiting, measuring whether she was an obstacle, a tool, or something worth hunting. The first direct blow to the fragile balance came on a night that had been planned as a controlled experiment rather than a turning point. After weeks inside Victor's house, Kara was finally allowed to return to the rooftop bar. Officially, it served as a legal and social cover. No one could afford whispers about a bartender who had vanished without explanation. Unofficially, it served as a test of the security net Victor had built around her. A field rehearsal to see whether his house truly controlled her movements as tightly as he believed. The precautions were meticulous. One man from Victor's team sat at the bar in a casual shirt, pretending to flirt with the staff and watch sports on the mounted screens. Another remained near the entrance, his posture slightly too upright for a real tourist, but subtle enough to pass among hotel guests. A third waited in a parked car at street level, engine cold, but ready to move at a moment's notice. Kara carried a discreet panic button sewn into the lining of her apron. Microphones along the back wall had been checked twice. They had rehearsed hand gestures that would signal trouble. On paper, it looked solid. As evening turned into night, the city shifted into its humid, restless version of normal. The air over the Mississippi grew heavy and wet, reflecting light in a way that made distant bridges and cranes look slightly blurred. A swollen moon hung above the skyline, too bright for the thickness of the clouds around it. The smell of wet asphalt and river mud pressed upward from the streets, creeping into the bar every time the terrace doors opened. The sky felt low, as if the whole city had been pushed down under a damp, invisible lid. At first, everything followed the expected patterns. A group of tourists arrived in a noisy cluster, sunscreen still visible along their collars, voices pitched a little too loud from alcohol and excitement. They demanded sweet cocktails with umbrellas, took photos against the glass barrier, posed with the lights of New Orleans behind them and the river a soft darkness below. Kara mixed drinks with automatic precision, smiled when required, and let her eyes move over the room in the practiced, analytical way that had become second nature. After the tourists came a pair of locals, already half drunk. Their shirts were loud, their perfume cheap and overpowering, their gestures wide and sloppy. They leaned on the bar, laughed too hard, and filled the air with the sticky scent of spilled liquor. The noise level climbed. Glass clinked, ice rattled, blenders whirred. A playlist of familiar tracks washed through the space in a steady, numbing stream. It was in that mess of color, sound, and movement that the others slipped in. They did not arrive in a group. A man in a dark jacket took a table near a service door. Another leaned against the rail of the terrace, acting fascinated by the view. A third settled at a two-top near the corridor leading to the staff area. On a quick glance, they blended with the rest. Business casual clothes, neutral expressions, the slightly tired air of people who had worked late. Only if someone paid close attention could they notice how their movements were too economical, their awareness too sharp, their eyes never truly unfocused. Kara should have noticed them sooner. On any other night she might have. But her attention kept flickering between the familiar faces of regulars, the tourists demanding attention, and the subtle signals from Victor's security. There was always the nagging awareness that this was a test, and that failing it could mean being locked back in the house indefinitely. She monitored herself, posture, tone, gestures, trying to appear relaxed while knowing she was being evaluated. The abduction did not begin in the open space of the bar where cameras watched every table and corner. The hunters understood surveillance just as well as Victor did. They chose a route that slipped alongside the edges of the visible grid, using blind spots created by architecture and routine. It started when a bartender from the back called for help with ice, just as he often did on busy nights. Kara, acting on ingrained habit, stepped away from the main counter, wiped her hands on her apron, and moved through the narrow service corridor that branched away from the glow of the main room. The corridor felt cooler and dimmer, lit by tired fluorescent strips that buzzed faintly above. The sounds from the bar softened into a muffled rumble behind her, filtered through doors and walls. The smell changed from citrus and alcohol to detergent, plastic, and metal. The space was familiar enough that she relaxed by a fraction, muscles loosening from the constant need to perform. That tiny lapse was all it took. Hands dropped onto her shoulders from behind with a speed and certainty that bypassed her reflexes. The grip was precise, cutting off the instinctive twist she tried to make. Fingers locked against muscle in a way that spoke of training and practice rather than random aggression. Before her brain finished assembling the fact of physical contact, her body had already been turned toward the wall. A second presence pressed close at her side, guiding rather than shoving, making it look like an ordinary moment between coworkers if anyone happened to glance in. There was a scent that did not belong in the staff hallway. It reached her in a thin, metallic thread beneath the smells of cleaning supplies and cold air. It carried iron and something deeply animal, reminiscent of wet fur and rain-soaked earth, faint but undeniable. Her heart rate spiked, and her mind scrambled to summon the code words, the signals, the remembered location of the panic button. A sharp sting pierced the skin just below her ribs before she could force her hand to move. The sedative traveled fast. Warm numbness poured through her veins, dragging her limbs away from her control. The hallway tilted. Light smeared into pale streaks. The grip on her shoulders became the only stable point in a world that seemed to slide sideways. Sounds receded. The far-off crash of ice into metal bins, the filtered bass from the bar, the click of a door opening onto a stairwell. Someone spoke near her, low and measured, but the words blurred into a single impression of balance, of a scale that needed to be corrected. The last clear sensation she registered was the change in temperature as she crossed from the corridor to the stairwell. The air grew colder and carried the smell of concrete and exterior walls. A draft brushed past her face, carrying city sounds from far below. Then the floor rose toward her, or she fell toward it. Her body no longer distinguished direction. Darkness folded over her, not sudden but thick and inevitable. When consciousness returned, it did so in uneven pieces. First came the smell: rust, stagnant water, old smoke, and something dense that settled heavy in the lungs. Then the awareness of hardness beneath her, cracked concrete, scattered debris pressing into her palms. Light seeped into the edges of her vision, gray and sickly, filtering through high, dirty windows. Her head throbbed in a slow, pulsing rhythm that made the outlines of the world swim every time she tried to move too fast. She lay in a wide, open space that had once been part of a working warehouse. Steel beams crossed the ceiling overhead, some wrapped in flacking paint, others stained dark. The walls carried layers of graffiti, sharp, angry lines, symbols, names, curses. Burn marks on the floor outlined where fires had been made in the past, leaving circular patches of soot and warped concrete. Puddles gathered in uneven dips, reflecting the overhead structure in distorted fragments. This place belonged to no formal authority. There were no polished corridors, no hidden cameras in light fixtures, no disciplined staff in tailored suits. It was a territory claimed by presence alone. Kara understood without being told that she was among the pack now, not as a guest, but as a captured piece in an ongoing game. Figures moved at the edges of her vision, shapes leaning against columns, packing in slow arcs, watching her with the alert stillness of animals assessing an unfamiliar intruder. Their clothing was mixed. Some wore work jackets and boots, others hoodies and worn jeans, but all carried the same physical intensity, as though their bodies were always a fraction away from motion. Their attention sharpened when she stirred, and the air in the room seemed to thicken with focus. Elijah Brooks stepped out from among them like the natural center of a circle that had always been there. In person, he looked less like a leader of an organization and more like the embodiment of a force. His frame was large, built on broad shoulders and a chest that suggested effortless strength rather than gym-honed vanity. He moved with the casual assurance of someone accustomed to dominance not granted by a title, but enforced whenever challenged. His eyes locked onto Kara with a clarity that made her feel as if he were cataloging every detail. The stiffness of her posture, the lingering effects of the sedative, the flicker of fear she tried to contain. There was no human tiredness in his expression. Instead, there was a deep, unblinking understanding, the way a predator understood both danger and opportunity in equal measure. He regarded Victor as a parasite in control of the city's heart, a force that had turned the central districts into a curated feeding ground defined on his own terms. The house, in Elijah's view, wrapped itself in charity, restoration projects, and social prestige while draining power from everyone forced to live under its rules. He wanted that grip broken, not for the sake of balance, but to replace it with his own law, drawn from the instincts of pack life and territorial claim. Kara did not need his direct words to understand this. It radiated from the way he stood, the way his pack watched him, the way the entire space seemed to arrange itself around his will. Her mind struggled as it compared what she had learned in Victor's house with what she saw here. Victor's domain was clean, controlled, precise. Elijah's was raw, visceral, deliberately free of the polished concealment that marked Victor's operations. Yet beneath the differences lay disturbing similarities. Both systems demanded obedience. Both justified their methods as necessary. Both hid the cost from those who walked the city streets unaware. The pack did not intend to kill her immediately. Death would have been wasteful. She had become too useful to Victor, too tightly woven into his processes, for her loss to go unanswered. Elijah's people understood that taking her out of Victor's house did more than remove a tool. It damaged Victor's confidence and forced him to respond. Kara became a bargaining chip, a pressure point that could be used to pull Victor into a position of vulnerability. They knew he would come to the table rather than risk letting her disappearance stand. They knew that by touching someone from inside his house, they had already broken an unspoken boundary. Above the warehouse, the moon continued its slow climb, invisible but heavy, pulling at tides and blood. The men who guarded her shifted restlessly as hours passed, their bodies visibly tense, their breathing shallower, as if something in them accelerated with each passing minute of night. Back in Victor's mansion, operations shifted into crisis mode. Technicians pulled camera feeds from the bar and surrounding streets, tracking every possible movement frame by frame. Routes were reconstructed, where she had walked, who had passed close, which vehicles had lingered near exits. Lists of staff were cross-checked, looking for weaknesses or potential informants. Maps of the city lit up with red markers, each representing a possible pathway by which she could have been moved. What had previously been a vibrant tourist city reassembled itself on Victor's screens into an abstract board of streets, zones, and influence lines. Every underpass, warehouse district, and river dock changed from a neutral landmark into a potential trap. An overt assault on the warehouse would risk open violence that could not be concealed. Gunshots, witnesses, bodies. It would invite questions from authorities and escalation from the packs. Negotiation, however distasteful, offered time and options, but also signaled that Victor could be forced to step into the open. The decision Victor made broke with his usual practice of acting through intermediaries. Rather than remain in the safety of his office while others carried his messages, he chose to appear in person at the border of pack-controlled territory. He moved not as a solitary hero, but as a leader fully aware that predators measured respect by the risks someone was willing to take. His presence would serve as its own kind of statement, that the house was willing to stand at the edge of its claimed world, in the dark, without the filter of polished rooms and security glass. For Kara, the realization of this choice came as a slow, spreading chill. She understood that she was no longer a bystander dragged along by events. The tension between Victor and Elijah was not abstract ideology anymore. It condensed around her like invisible lines converging on a single point. Every calculation, every countermove, every unspoken threat considered her survival, her value, her potential as a symbol. When the time finally came to move her from the deeper interior of the warehouse toward an open area near its entrance, the air itself seemed to change. The pack formed around her in a loose but intentional formation, bodies positioned to react instantly to any movement. Outside, beyond rusted doors and cracked concrete, the city's normal sounds felt distant, filtered by distance and the late hour. The river murmured, traffic thinned to occasional bursts, and somewhere a dog barked at nothing visible. Between the two territories, in a strip of land that belonged fully to neither, the night seemed to hold its breath. Old agreements, broken promises, and grudges older than any official record pressed down on that space. Kara stood within it, her heart beating too fast, aware that the invisible line between myth and reality had been crossed long ago. Now the only line that mattered ran through her, dividing the life she once had from whatever would follow once Victor and Elijah finally stood facing each other under the weight of the moon. The night by the river marked the moment when Kara's choices ceased to belong solely to her. Until then, she had moved through the conflict like a displaced piece on someone else's game board, pushed and pulled by forces older and stronger than she understood. But standing between the house and the pack on that stretch of cracked concrete, with the water shining faintly behind the warehouses, she realized that her presence had become a point of balance. Both sides watched her not as a bystander, but as a potential catalyst. Victor stood with the composed restraint of someone who had learned long ago to wield silence as a weapon. His expression held no visible aggression, yet the air around him tightened with controlled authority. Everything about his posture suggested precision. The squared shoulders, the steady breathing, the almost imperceptible lift of his chin. His followers mirrored his stillness, creating a quiet perimeter behind him. Elijah faced him like the embodiment of a different law. His stance was grounded, primal, as though the earth itself lent him strength. His chest rose and fell with a rhythm that betrayed heightened senses, and the faint tension in his hands hinted at claws waiting just beneath the surface of his skin. The members of his pack lingered in the shadows, shifting subtly, their movements fluid in a way that had little to do with human anatomy. Kara stood between these opposites, feeling the weight of their expectations settle on her shoulders. Before this night, she had told herself that she was merely a witness dragged into a hidden world. Now, she saw that her insight, her ability to read people, to understand the motivations behind behavior, was something both factions recognized as valuable. Her fear mixed with a dawning sense of responsibility she had never asked for. Elijah's accusations pressed through the humid night air with the force of conviction shaped by years of resentment. He saw the house as an oppressive structure feeding on the lifeblood of the city. He regarded Victor as the architect of a system built on fear, designed to keep the population unaware while extracting whatever benefit could be gained from the night. His presence radiated a belief that the pack's instinctual freedom had been chained for too long. Victor's response carried the weight of a strategist who understood the cost of ungoverned chaos. In his view, the pack's unrestrained nature threatened the fragile secrecy that allowed their kind to coexist with humanity. He believed that without structure, the city would spiral into violence that neither side could conceal. His cold logic suggested that survival required harsh boundaries and discreet but firm control. Kara found herself internally recoiling from both of them. In Victor, she saw a calculating overseer willing to sacrifice individuals for the sake of stability. In Elijah, she sensed a leader ready to let instinct justify destruction. Neither of them truly understood the position of those caught in the crossfire: bartenders walking home after closing shifts, warehouse workers loading trucks at dawn, unsuspecting pedestrians who vanished into the statistics of missing persons. Her thoughts formed not as a speech, but as an accumulation of truths she could no longer ignore. She remembered the perpetual tension among the house's human employees, the silent fear in their movements during nights when something unseen prowled the halls. She thought of the hidden panic masked behind the orderliness of Victor's estate. She recalled the lost boys from the industrial district, names that flickered briefly in police logs before fading into unsolved cases. Each memory built upon the last, shaping a picture of a city strained under a conflict it could not perceive. Her proposal emerged from that mixture of fear, observation, and unwilling clarity. She suggested well-defined territorial boundaries where neither side would trespass with hostile intent. She proposed limiting the house's influence in areas where the pack maintained its own version of order. She envisioned neutral zones, unmarked sanctuaries where humans lived and worked without being drawn into the invisible war. She framed it not around the desires of either leader, but around the survival of those who had no voice in these negotiations. For Victor, the proposal required relinquishing a measure of control, something he had rarely done. For Elijah, it demanded reining in the instincts of his pack, accepting restrictions that contradicted their nature. Yet the alternative was escalation, a cycle of retaliation that would eventually spill into the human world and expose them all. The decision did not solidify that night, but something shifted in the charged atmosphere. Neither leader advanced, neither retreated. Instead, they acknowledged with reluctant calculation that an accord might prevent their world from collapsing. Over the following weeks, the foundations of the agreement took form. The house restructured its network, redirecting resources toward monitoring potential conflicts rather than enforcing dominance. Analysts joined guards in reviewing movements along the emerging borders. Victor adjusted the hierarchy of his organization, replacing several enforcers with tacticians able to predict aggression rather than respond to it. The pack imposed new rules within its territory. Elijah demanded discipline from his followers, ensuring that their hunts occurred far from human populations and that no member acted without considering the consequences for the entire pack. Younger werewolves bristled under the new controls, but Elijah held them in line with an authority that required no threats. Neutral territories emerged one by one across the city. The rooftop bar where Kara had spent so many nights became one such location, its boundaries invisible but absolute. Neither faction entered it with malicious intent. Neither saw it as a battlefield. Humans continued to drink, laugh, and live there, unaware that two predators had silently agreed to protect the space. For Kara, the cost of the accord revealed itself slowly. She regained fragments of her freedom, the ability to return to work, to walk through her neighborhood without the oppressive dread of pursuit, to take care of her father without constant surveillance. Yet with every regained freedom came a new weight. Her insights became part of the framework that supported the agreement. Her intuition was consulted whenever tensions rose along the boundaries. Her understanding of behavior shaped the rules that governed a city split between human routine and supernatural conflict. She had become an axis around which a fragile stability rotated. The house depended on her interpretations. The pack relied on her neutrality. The city continued sleeping in ignorance because she held two opposing forces in uneasy balance. The accord provided no peace. It provided breath, thin, precarious, and temporary. But for the first time since her abduction, she felt the city exhale, as though the night itself recognized the value of a fragile truce. Kara understood the truth beneath it all. The price of the accord was carried not only by the leaders who signed it, but by the person who had been unwillingly placed at its center. New Orleans had moved through the years with its familiar mixture of beauty and decay, yet beneath the surface the city had reshaped itself in ways invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. Tourists still wandered with plastic cups filled with syrupy cocktails, and street musicians still played on corners worn smooth by generations. The heavy scent of jasmine still mingled with gasoline and the damp breath of the river. But for those who lived in the city's hidden architecture, the rhythm had changed. The old balance between night and day, predator and watcher, house and pack had transformed into a complex network of quiet agreements, mapped territories, and invisible scars left by conflicts no human newspaper would ever mention. Victor's house had refined its public face. What had once been a shadowed network of enforcers and analysts became a seemingly legitimate chain of private security firms, risk assessment bureaus, and discreet consulting agencies. Behind polished offices and tailored suits still hid the inner machinery of control, populated by individuals who could sense lies by heartbeat, track danger by scent, or appear and vanish with inhuman fluidity. The house had become efficient, almost corporate in its operations, with Victor at its center like a still, cold axis controlling gravity. The pack under Elijah had also evolved. Once a raw and unpredictable force along the edges of the city, it consolidated its domains with discipline that surprised even its own members. They fortified abandoned industrial blocks, reclaimed overgrown lots, and transformed neglected neighborhoods into self-contained ecosystems that thrived after dusk. The police still avoided these districts, but there were fewer unexplained bodies, fewer disappearances, fewer incidents that forced the predatory nature of the pack into public light. Elijah's authority held them in check, at least enough to honor the fragile agreement. Between these two powers existed the weaving, trembling membrane of the pact, a living boundary that was never static. One reckless act from either side could send the city spiraling back into bloodshed. It was this delicate balance that defined the years that followed, and at the heart of that balance stood Kara Holt. Her role was one that defied titles. For some, she was an analyst specializing in behavioral risk. For others, she was a mediator, the single human figure who could stand between creatures bound by instinct and history. She read faces and motives the way others read weather. She identified tremors before they became earthquakes. Her presence was requested during negotiations over trespasses, during investigations of missing persons, during the tense nights when both house and pack felt pressure from forces even deeper in the city's underlayers. To her father, she was simply a daughter who brought home medication on time, managed bills, and stayed up late in the kitchen with her laptop open, claiming extra project work. He never suspected that the documents on her screen involved sent signatures, territorial breaches, or surveillance stills where eyes glowed faintly in infrared. Sometimes Kara returned to the rooftop bar where everything had begun. Standing there, she saw the city in a way no one else did. The glowing grid of streets became a living map of alliances and forbiddances. She could trace the invisible borders where the house's influence ended and the pack's dominion began. She recognized the neutral islands, hotels, studios, certain restaurants, where both sides agreed to behave as if they were ordinary. She watched clusters of students celebrating their youth beneath neon lights, unaware of watchers perched in darkness above them, calculating risks with instincts honed over generations. Her connection with Victor deepened in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with survival. They had shared too many nights analyzing threats that could swallow the city whole. They had stood together in rooms vibrating with tension, choosing between violent responses and strategic restraint. The trust that formed between them was built on wounds, truth, and the quiet understanding that neither expected perfection from the other. Victor's discipline and her intuition complemented one another, though there were still parts of his nature she could not decipher, shadows he kept even from those closest to him. Her relationship with Elijah remained strained but strangely respectful. The pack saw her as someone who had prevented a massacre, both theirs and the house. Elijah evaluated her with the calm scrutiny of a predator acknowledging a creature outside his hierarchy, but essential to the ecosystem. In the rare moments they crossed paths on neutral grounds, his gaze reflected a wordless recognition of her influence and an unyielding refusal to forgive her alignment with the house. She understood that for Elijah, choosing a side was not political. It was personal, instinctive, rooted in the core of his identity. The city lived suspended between light and shadow. Conflict still erupted, though smaller and more contained than before. A missing courier, a broken agreement about feeding grounds, a patrol that stepped too far past its boundary, each risked destabilizing months of careful peace. Kara often acted as the thin thread pulling the situation back from collapse. She understood that the system's survival depended not on eliminating violence, but on anticipating and redirecting it. The house guarded order. The pack guarded instinct. She, somehow, guarded the fragile space in between. One night, standing in Victor's high-walled study with its blend of old-world carvings and modern surveillance screens, she found herself staring again at the skyline she once viewed through the glass of the rooftop bar. She tried to imagine an alternate past, one in which she had kept silent on that first night, one in which she had walked away from the man by the window and returned to polishing glasses and counting tips. Perhaps Victor would have become a casualty of an unseen war. Perhaps the pack would have surged into the center with overwhelming force. Perhaps the city would have fractured into a chaos from which no pact could ever emerge. Perhaps she would have lived a simpler life, home, work, small worries, predictable routines. Yet none of those possibilities offered what she had now, the ability to alter the trajectory of events that affected thousands, the power to see patterns that others could not, the strange, heavy privilege of helping to restrain the darkness rather than pretending it did not exist. She did not see herself as a hero. Heroes belonged to myths. What she had become was something quieter, anchored in grit rather than glory. New Orleans breathed differently now. The darkness had not been banished, the light had not conquered. But between the two forces emerged a mesh of understanding built from necessity, compromise, and the guarded cooperation of those who had once been sworn enemies. The people who walked beneath the street lamps remained blissfully unaware, and perhaps that was for the best. The city's most fragile hope rested on the notion that ignorance could sometimes be a shield. Kara knew the equilibrium could collapse at any moment. A single death in the wrong place, a single territorial misstep, a single leader pushed too far could unravel everything. And yet, night after night, the city held. It endured. It adapted. It became a place where monsters and protectors lived side by side, each constrained by rules written in shadow and enforced in silence. She stood at the edge of the balcony overlooking the river, watching lights flicker along the water. In those reflections, she saw the truth she had learned through all the years. The night would always be there, vast and patient, but it did not have to devour everything. A city did not need to choose between the dark and the light. It only needed people willing to stand in the shifting space between them, holding the line long enough for the dawn to matter. And in that fragile space, Kara had found her place. Not safe, not simple, not clean, but undeniably real. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.